Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a global moment that really feels like something out of a high-stakes thriller.
hmm
We're talking about a massive military operation, the immediate counterpunch, and these profound ripple effects that are shaking the Middle East.
Yeah.
We've gathered some incredibly detailed information, and it paints a pretty vivid picture of these events as they unfolded and, the complex aftermath.
Indeed. So what we're really trying to do here is pull out the key stuff from the material we have, right, to help you understand not just what happened,
Right.
but really why it matters and what sort of questions it raises for the future. We'll be looking at these unprecedented military actions, the immediate reactions, and, the different viewpoints on what might come next.
And the scope is pretty wide. I mean, we've got everything from the specifics of the military op to high-level diplomacy and even the political ripples right here at home.
Okay.
So yeah, let's unpack this. So here's where it gets really interesting, according to the info we have. The sheer scale. Reports are calling this the largest B-2 bomber operation in history.
Yeah, think about that. The B-2.
Just think about that for a second. The stealth, the payload. That alone tells you something big was intended.
And what's fascinating, technically speaking, is the first-time use, we think, of the 15-ton massive ordnance penetrator, the MOP.
OP.
This is a bungle buster, right? Designed specifically to go deep underground, take out hardened facilities, and the accounts detail 14 MOPs dropped.
14.
14. Across two critical nuclear target areas, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. Using that kind of weapon, it points to a very precise, very destructive goal.
And the secrecy around it. The element of surprise, it's just extraordinary. These planes, we're told, flew from, the middle of America, Missouri,
Air Force Base, all the way across the globe.
and arrived over these, incredibly sensitive Iranian sites, completely undetected. The information says they were on their way home almost right after the strike.
Wow.
Well, it raises that important question, doesn't it? How did they achieve that? The strategic deception must have been key.
Okay.
The materials describe B-2s first heading west toward Guam, maybe as a feint. Then 7 of them peel off, shift course east towards Iran, refueling in the air. It's complex. Speaks volumes about the planning involved to get that total surprise.
Right.
And we also see reports suggesting Navy submarines near the Persian Gulf might have launched Tomahawks at the same time.
So a coordinated attack then.
Potentially, yeah. A multi-pronged assault targeting nuclear facilities.
Okay, so what about the damage? Do we know how effective the strikes actually were? Any initial reads?
Well, there are apparently before and after satellite images showing, significant destruction at all 3 sites.
Okay.
But there are some caveats, concerns that Iran might have moved some of its highly enriched uranium beforehand.
Okay. So not a complete picture yet.
Not yet. The full battle damage assessments, the BDAs, they're still awaited to gauge the full impact. But the visuals we do have suggest it was substantial, a clear message sent.
And a message like that, wouldn't go unanswered, right?
Yeah.
Within hours, the Islamic regime responded. What did that look like based on the accounts?
Swiftly, yeah. The intelligence we've seen points to a barrage of about 25 missiles launched by Iran.
25.
Yeah. One reportedly hit an area north of Tel Aviv, caused around 20 injuries. Thankfully, no fatalities reported in that specific incident.
Okay, 20 injuries is still significant, though.
Absolutely. And the material describes this as part of a continuous pattern of missile attacks targeting civilian areas. So it's not just a one-off retaliation.
It's just a pattern, a tactic.
Exactly. Sustained pressure and a willingness to hit back directly, even, against civilian communities.
And the information we've reviewed also really hammers home this stark ideological divide. It states the threat from Iran isn't just seen as being against Israel, but against, quote, all Western ideology. With these long-standing calls for the death of Israel, death of the United States, that's pretty fundamental opposition.
It is. And if you connect that to the diplomatic picture, Iran's foreign minister, right after the strike, apparently declared the time for diplomacy is over.
That's blunt.
Very. He said attacking nuclear facilities crossed a very big red line, essentially saying there's, quote, not much room left for diplomacy. Coming from a foreign minister, that's a major signal.
It really shifts the ground, doesn't it? Away from negotiation.
Absolutely. It pushes things into a different space where maybe talking is even seen as weakness.
Which brings us to this really fascinating point in the material, the whole idea of regime change. President Trump mentioned it on social media, but the language,
Yeah,
it's quite nuanced, isn't it?
it is, yeah. Trump's post suggested that, okay, maybe the term isn't politically correct, but he asked, essentially, if the Iranian regime can't make Iran great again, make a, what's the phrase?
Make it.
Right. Then why wouldn't there be a regime change? It sort of hints subtly at an internal transformation, maybe a change in the regime's character or who's in charge.
Rather than tanks rolling in.
Exactly. Rather than direct external military intervention to remove them. And that distinction, I think, is really crucial here.
Meanwhile, you have the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu praising Trump very highly, saying, history will record that President Trump acted to deny the world's most dangerous regime, the world's most dangerous weapons.
He called it a pivot of history.
A pivot of history. That's strong language. Suggests a huge, maybe irreversible shift.
It does. And adding another layer here is the analysis from Michael Oren, the former Israeli ambassador to the U.S.
Okay, what did he say?
He draws this really important distinction between just, ending the fighting and actually achieving regime change.
Yeah.
He points out that, yes, Israel hit Fordo again, but they also bombed targets that had, quote, immense political significance.
Ah, okay. Not just military or strategic targets then, political ones.
Precisely. And that tells us something about the kind of change they might be aiming for.
So if it's not necessarily regime change by invasion, what's the thinking behind hitting these political significance targets? What does that accomplish?
Well, Oren mentioned specific examples. The notorious Evin prison.
Evin, yeah, where political prisoners are held.
Exactly. Held and reportedly tortured for years. Also, the headquarters of the besieged, he calls them civilian thugs, who, brutally suppress any domestic opposition.
Right.
And interestingly, the destruction clock, this symbolic clock that was publicly displayed, counting down to Israel's destruction around 2040.
They hit the clock.
Apparently so. The idea, according to Oren, is that by hitting these pillars of this horrendous regime, you weaken its internal control, its messaging.
Undermine its legitimacy from within.
That seems to be the goal, to ultimately make Iran non-nuclear by facilitating its removal or transformation rather than through direct occupation. It's about chipping away at its foundations.
So, let me see if I'm getting this right. The best guarantee against a nuclear Iran, in this view, isn't necessarily outside military force, but a fundamentally different Iran, maybe empowered by these strikes.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. The ambassador sees the current regime as inherently jihadist, very unlikely to change its core DNA, as he puts it.
Okay.
But White House messages seem open to an altered regime, maybe different people, maybe a different character. And that could mean empowering the Iranian people. Accounts mention 92 million people, many deeply unhappy with the government.
Letting them make Iran great again from the inside.
That seems to be the hope, yes. An organic transformation, perhaps sped up or enabled by these external actions.
Okay, shifting gears slightly, this brings up the whole economic leverage angle. Our information mentions Iran's parliament approving the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. That sounds major.
Oh, it's monumentally significant. You're talking about, what, 20% of the world's oil passing through that very narrow channel?
20%? Wow.
Yeah. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio apparently made it crystal clear doing that would trigger a massive and immensely punishing American reaction.
So a clear red line from the U.S. side, too.
Absolutely. Now, Iran's conventional navy, mostly speedboats, apparently.
Yeah.
So breaking a simple blockade might not be the hardest part. The real challenge would be mines. Mines, they can be incredibly effective, very difficult and dangerous to clear. Could shut down shipping for weeks, months maybe. It would require a huge international effort to deal with, causing massive economic pain, disproportionately so for Iran, but for the whole world too.
Okay, so beyond the immediate back and forth, what's the long game here? What's the ultimate goal according to the intelligence, especially if diplomacy's off the table for now?
Well, the primary overarching goal for both the U.S. and Israel seems crystal clear. Remove the Iranian nuclear threat.
The bomb.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The material specifically mentions 650 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, that's 20% and 60% enriched stuff. Enough, potentially, for 10 to 15 bombs. It is. And they have the missiles, the ballistic capability, and likely progress on a warhead. So the immediate goal is stopping that. But the broader hope, the vision articulated, is that if Iran does change fundamentally, you could see unimaginable peace breaking out in the Middle East. peace between Israel and Lebanon, Israel and Syria, and as one account puts it, who knows, someday maybe even peace between Israel and Iran.
It's a total transformation of the region.
That's the ultimate hope being expressed, yes.
And the narratives we're seeing, they draw these powerful historical parallels. Comparing this to Pearl Harbor or Fort Sumter,
Yeah.
what does invoking those events tell us about how significant this is perceived to be?
Well, using comparisons like Pearl Harbor or Fort Sumter positions these events as true game changers, right? Inflection points that completely reshape the strategic map.
Moments that altered history.
Exactly. Pearl Harbor brought the U.S. into World War II. Fort Sumter started the U.S. Civil War. So by framing these actions as potentially comparable to extraordinary military victories in history, the material suggests this isn't just a tactical success, but a fundamental shift. Something with really long-lasting consequences for the region, maybe even global security, events to be studied for decades.
Okay, let's bring this back home a bit. While all this plays out globally, there are obviously concerns here, especially for U.S. personnel in the region.
Right.
What about the, 40,000 troops there?
Right.
What steps are being taken?
Right, that's a major concern. The Pentagon, through Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and General Dan Kane, has reportedly put all units on high alert.
High alert makes sense.
Yeah. Personnel in places like Qatar, for example, are being advised to essentially bunker down, stay vigilant, and the president issued a very explicit warning
Okay.
that any action against U.S. assets or personnel would trigger swift retaliation, unleashing a, quote, volatile and lethal force that, quote, no one wants to see. It's a very strong deterrent message.
And here in the U.S. itself, any homeland security concerns or advisories linked to all this?
There are, yes. The intelligence reports mention concerns about potential terror cells. They cite observations of individuals crossing the southern border who raise suspicion, looking, quote, very much like Middle Easterns. So the advice coming from law enforcement to the public is basically, if you see something, do something. Report anything suspicious. Stay vigilant. It highlights that awareness of potential domestic blowback.
And finally, politically, here at home, the information mentions some friction, claims that Democratic members of Congress weren't notified about the strike beforehand, calling it unconstitutional.
Right, that came up. The White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, pushed back on that directly.
Okay, what was the response?
She stated that bipartisan leaders were notified. Names mentioned include Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer. Apparently, Jeffries was hard to reach initially, got his briefing a bit later, but the notification happened.
So the administration says they followed procedure.
They assert they did, yeah. And that President Trump acted fully within his constitutional authority, specifically citing Article 2 powers as commander-in-chief and the War Powers Act authority, arguing it was necessary for the defense of the U.S. homeland, given what they describe as Iran's repeated threats and provocations.
Wow. Okay, so we've really covered a lot of ground here, from the details of this massive military operation to these really complex, layered discussions about what regime change might even mean in this context, and the huge global stakes, like the Strait of Hormuz. It's just, it's clear this is a situation that's still very much unfolding.
Absolutely. And if we try to connect it all back, try to see the bigger picture, the material really pushes us to think about the long-term effects, right, on stability in the region. Can this kind of decisive action, this potential pivot, actually lead to a new era of peace if Iran changes? Or does it just, reset the chessboard into potentially an even more volatile configuration?
A huge question.
It really is. And that's something I think for all of us to keep watching, keep pondering as things develop.
Definitely something to keep thinking about. We hope this deep dive gave you a richer, maybe more nuanced understanding of the information surrounding these events.
I hope so.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning. Welcome back to the Deep.